And joining us now is Jeremi Suri, who holds the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where he's a professor of history and public affairs. He's the co-host of the podcast This is Democracy and the author and editor of a number of books, including The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office, and the forthcoming book Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jeremi Suri.
Nice to be on with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Jeremy. And over the weekend, the Texas Republican Party had their convention, and they effectively voted against democracy. Here you are with your book coming out soon on the unfinished fight for democracy. Well, they're fighting against democracy in Texas by the look of it.
I think the leadership of the Republican Party is fighting against democracy. That doesn't mean that mainstream Republicans are in Texas, but the leadership of the Republican Party is composed largely of white men and women who are recognizing that the state of Texas is no longer a white state. It's no longer a state dominated by the sorts of rural politics and ranch politics, gun-toting politics that they're comfortable with. And so they don't support democracy any longer, the leaders of the Republican Party, because they know they can't win in a democracy in Texas any longer.
And this is Donald Trump's GOP. So this means that this is what the Republican base is all about, and it would seem that there's worse to come.
Well, yes and no. I think it's probably less Donald Trump's GOP than Ron DeSantis's GOP. I think what Governor DeSantis in Florida is trying to do is position himself as someone who speaks even better to those values by attacking homosexuality and other life choices by individuals, by attacking abortion, by attacking businesses in the way he is attacking Disney. I think that's the politics you're seeing in the Texas Republican Party leadership. And it will cause trouble going forward, but I think that leadership is out of touch even with ardent Republicans in the state. More than 70% of Republicans, including in Texas, believe we should have some limits on gun usage. More than 70% of Republicans, including in Texas, believe the government should not attack businesses in the way that Governor DeSantis is. So I think the leadership of the party doesn't necessarily represent where the party is.
Well, obviously, the vote against the results of the 2020 elections is very much a Trump vote, or a vote for Trump. But I guess you could say some of the other measures that were passed by the Texas Republican Party are definitely got DeSantis' fingerprints on them. They voted to advance language in the party platform that described homosexuality as abnormal lifestyle choice and calls on students to learn about the humanity of the preborn child while voting against teaching children critical thinking. And, of course, they voted against gun control and booed Senator John Cornyn, along with other 10 Republicans who were involved in the bipartisan effort to have gun control. So are you suggesting in any way, Jeremy, that Ron DeSantis is actually a more dangerous presidential candidate than Trump himself, if that's possible?
Well, I mean, I think this is like the old debates over who was worse, Stalin or Hitler. I mean, and neither of these men are Stalin or Hitler. They're a different kind of threat. But I don't know. I mean, I think in some ways Donald Trump remains the biggest threat because he continues to deny the reality of the fact that he lost his election and lost badly. And he continues to encourage violence. He is directly, we've seen this already with the January 6th hearings and other evidence. He encouraged the violence on January 6th, and he continues to encourage violence at every one of his rallies now. So he is in some ways the most dangerous on a day-to-day basis. But I think Ron DeSantis is the most likely Trump kind of candidate to be running for president and to perhaps have a shot at winning. I don't think Donald Trump will be reelected. His negatives are too high. Among 56% of Americans think he should be put in jail. But I think DeSantis is the most threatening. If you think this agenda is a threat to democracy, which I do, DeSantis is the next logical leader of the kinds of policy positions that we've seen from the Republican Party leadership in Texas.
And again, I'm speaking with Jeremi Suri, who holds the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where he's a professor of history and public affairs. He's the co-host of the podcast This is Democracy and the author and editor of a number of books, including The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office, and the forthcoming Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. So we all recall Donald Trump during the 2016 primaries attacked a fellow Republican, John McCain, for being a war hero, literally
Yes.
attacked him for being a war hero, and said he likes his heroes who don't get captured. And of course, this coming from the guy that had, 6 or 7 deferments for bone spurs and other mythical infirmities to get out of the Vietnam War. But that's continuing, that kind of character assassination is continuing, particularly with Tucker Carlson, who has described Republican Representative Dan Crenshaw, calling him Eye Patch McCain. Now, the reason he wears an eye patch is that he's a former Navy SEAL who lost his eye in Afghanistan. And yet, Tucker Carlson feels free to trash this guy. And the attendees at the Republican convention in Texas over the weekend went after Dan Crenshaw and were chanting, Dan Crenshaw is a traitor. He needs to be hung for treason. And I guess his sin was that he attacked Marjorie Taylor Greene for being an idiot. So what other reason is there for going after Dan Crenshaw?
Well, I think what we're seeing, and this is, as a historian, I have to say, not new. It's more evident now. There have always been a small segment of the American public that believes that our society should not be open to progressive change of any kind, and that all that matters is keeping a certain group of people from a certain background in power. This was the story of the late 19th century throughout much of our country. It was the story of the 1930s. It was the story of the backlash against civil rights. So what we're seeing from those chants against Dan Crenshaw and against Senator John Cornyn, these are two very conservative politicians who are being accused, as you say, of being traitors because they're looking to compromise or at least call out the idiocy and undemocratic behavior of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. What we're seeing, though, is a kind of identity politics. These are individuals in the audience. They're a small group, but they're a very vocal and committed group to protecting America only for them. And democracy to them means power for their group. And this is not new. The difference between today, Ian, and 50 years ago is there's a Fox News and there's an internet that's circulating these images and infecting our public discourse in what would have otherwise been something that occurred, but we didn't see as much of 50 years ago.
Well, I guess the other sin of Dan Crenshaw's was that late last year in Texas, he said that, quote, there are 2 types of members of Congress. There's performance artists and legislators. The performance artists are the ones that get all the attention, the ones you think are more conservative because they know how to say slogans real well. They know how to recite the lines that they know our voters want to hear. And then he went on to say, we have grifters in our midst in the conservative movement, lie after lie after lie. And then, of course, he more recently attacked Marjorie Taylor Greene on Twitter because she and I guess the people at the convention over the weekend, I'm not sure of this, but she's been against helping out Ukraine in any way. And
That's correct.
Crenshaw, of course, is a former veteran who takes the opposite position. Was that also going on over the weekend?
As I understand it, that was an issue. It was not the main issue, but I think it all comes back to the same point. And I think you said this accurately, quoting Crenshaw, that it's performance art, but it's performance art that has a seriousness to it. There's a sense that this should be America first only for certain people, and that others are stealing our country from us by supporting Ukraine, by allowing women to make choices with their bodies, by even compromising on these issues. And the act of legislation always involves, especially in a 50-50 Senate, it always involves give and take. And extreme thinkers on the Democratic side are objecting to this too, but they don't object as violently. They don't object in such racist ways. But this has been built into right-wing rhetoric in our country for 200 years. But as you said, the internet and Fox News give people a platform, and that's what's really dangerous, that this is then a platform to promote this kind of hate to a broader audience. And even though I think most people reject it, we know that some people listen and get drawn into it. It becomes intoxicating, unfortunately intoxicating sometimes for 18-year-olds who go out and buy guns and then go and shoot a school. I think what happened in Buffalo and Uvalde is directly connected to what we're talking about right now.
And in terms of the far right of the Republican Party rejecting military aid to Ukraine, while clearly before our eyes we see Russia, or Putin, I should say, because I think there's a huge difference between the Russian people and Putin. And indeed, the more you demonize the Russian people, the more you play into Putin's hands, because him and his former Prime Minister Medvedev is saying that the West hates us. Well, the West doesn't hate Russian people, but it sure hates what Putin is doing, murdering a country before our eyes. And yet you've got these people like Tucker Carlson shilling for the Russians, or for Putin, I should say. And again, Crenshaw apparently in tweeting out against Marjorie Taylor Greene said to her, still going after that slot on Russia today, hey? So why are they all in with Putin when, you know, the traditional GOP was the great sort of anti-Soviet, Soviet bashing party?
At the end of World War II, and especially during the Eisenhower presidency, the Republican Party defined its foreign policy along anti-communist, hard-line actions, often aggressive actions toward the Soviet Union and other perceived enemies. But in spite of that position, within the Republican Party, there were still strong isolationist groups that believed we shouldn't spend our money overseas for fiscally conservative reasons, groups that believed the United States should not support decolonization, should not support groups of people overseas who were non-white, and groups that were skeptical about anything the United States could do to help other people that didn't help us first. And I think what we're seeing today is not really just an identification with Putin, but a return to an isolationism among many Republicans who, after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, believe that these activities have not benefited their communities, have not benefited their people, and want to hoard our resources for ourselves. They see Vladimir Putin as a convenient ally, because what he wants is the United States to disengage from the world as well. And so it's not as if they're supporting Putin per se, but what they are supporting is a disengaged United States which would allow Russia to do more overseas, and in their eyes allow the United States to use its resources only for the right Americans at home.
Well, just in closing, Jeremi Suri, do you think that the majority of, you mentioned that the majority of Texas Republicans don't go along with this. So could Biden and the Democrats tap into that reservoir of rejection of this far-right trend and the Trump takeover of the GOP?
Yes and no. I think the challenge is that many of the Republicans, the majority who reject what we saw at this Republican Party convention here in Texas, the majority who reject this also reject the Democrats. They see Democrats as socialists. They do buy into that. And as a consequence, it's hard to get them to vote Democrat. But what is possible is to get them not to support certain Republicans. And so I think what Beto O'Rourke, running for governor, and what Joe Biden are trying to do is convince those who are on the left and in the center to vote Democrat, and those who are on the right to at least not vote for these kinds of figures who support this abhorrent, anti-democratic, anti-homosexual, anti-woman set of positions. And so the idea is to try to drive up the turnout in the center and the left and drive down the turnout on the right.
Well, Jeremi Suri, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
And again, I've been speaking with Jeremi Suri, who holds the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where he's a professor of history and public affairs. He's the co-host of the podcast This is Democracy and the author and editor of a number of books, including The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office, and the forthcoming book Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into the dissolution of Israel's ruling coalition and how Biden will be meeting with Prime Minister Lapid in his upcoming July visit that includes a trip to Saudi Arabia, which is already